I'm Jamie Burns. Today we're going to be talking about how to use a lab still and how a lab still can fit in with your production distillery. I work with the family Jones here in Denver, Colorado. I am the lead distiller at our Denver facility. I've been in the distilling industry for a decade and I have a master's degree from Heriot-Watt University. A little bit of background on the family Jones. We've been in business since 2017. We operate a tasting room and pilot scale distillery in Denver, and then have a larger production facility in Loveland, Colorado. We at the Denver facility have an award-winning tasting room downstairs, the full bar service, and we operate with a distiller's manufacturing permit, which here in Colorado means that we have to make everything that we serve across the bar. So a lab still fits in with our bar program downstairs because we're able to make a lot of small one-off spirits and also a range of modifiers and liqueurs that will support the bar program downstairs. The lab still is a very small fraction of our overall production, but it is an important part as it allows us to create all the different cocktails that aren't just spirits alone or fruit juice. We're able to create around a dozen modifiers ranging from vermouth substitutes to orange liqueurs to creme de cacao. And we've had some really good success with our liqueurs. Our orange liqueur that we made exclusively for the tasting room has since been something that we've scaled up to our large-scale production runs and distribute into the wider world. We're here in our Denver Distilleries lab with our 3-liter lab still. Today in this class, we're going to cover the different components of a lab still, how to set up and run a lab still, how to build recipes that scale using the lab still. We'll also talk about how to use a lab still to run test distillations on liqueurs to check for ABV. This here is our 3-liter lab still. We are able to use it to do a bunch of different things, but I wanted to introduce you to the different components that go into the still itself. Starting with the heating mantle is the very base of the lab still. This is what powers the distillation. So this is electric heat mantle, and it is controlled by a controller that sits up here. And then the controller feedback is a thermometer that runs to the top of the still. For the still itself, we have the boiling flask. This is going to be the equivalent to the pot of a lab still. Ours is 3 liters in volume. It has a nice wide neck on it here, and that allows us to add botanicals straight to the pot, and it makes it easier to clean. That tapers down into a neck and then goes into the column. Our column has a bulb in it, similar to an onion or a lamp glass on a still. Not all lab stills will have the bubble on it. It's not necessarily needed, but it will provide a little more rectification. It'll be more similar to what we have in our full-scale production still. Following up, we have the rest of the column, and that leads into the line arm and the condenser. So the spirit path, after it is vaporized, goes up the column, runs through the condenser, goes through the internal spiral of glass, and we have cold water that we flow through the outside of the coil to chill the vapor back into a spirit, which then comes out the receiver. The receiver is supported here by a lab stand. It's definitely an important piece of it. And then below we have the adjustable table that we will place our different collection containers on. Pretty basic setup, but it is very versatile, allows us to do a lot of different things. It's very good at botanical distillations. It's not going to be ideal for doing, say a whiskey mash, something with a lot of solids in it that can scorch on the bottom of the boiling flask. So we typically are going to do botanical distillations on it rather than test batches of very small fermentations. There are definitely some other components that go into the lab distillation that are very useful to have on hand, so I want to cover those with you guys. So safety-wise, really like to have a pair of safety glasses. Safety glasses is important, make sure your eyes are being protected. Then another safety component is going to be some thick rubber gloves that are going to be heat resistant. We're dealing with hot liquids, so it is useful to have the heat resistant gloves as we are cleaning out the still. Other things that are going to be useful are a collection of different size beakers. Depending on what you're making, it's nice to have the different volumes options, and then they're going to be marked on the side with volumes. Not super accurate, but going to be very, very rough, crude volumes, which is nice to have. As well as graduated cylinders, which will give you a more accurate volume. Again, having a range of size from 10 milliliters up to 500 milliliters is nice for our setup. I like to have a silicone grease, helps with the ground glass joints to create a good seal. Definitely a nice component for the setup. Then also very critical is a notebook of some type. I like this tablet just to take notes on. Taking notes and recording what you're doing is going to be a critical part of using your lab still so that you have replicable results. Definitely whatever works for you, but some type of note-taking device is needed. Copper mesh would be an optional component of the still. I find that during distillation of botanicals with a neutral spirit, it's not needed, but you can definitely add it to the still if you want to closely mimic your large copper production still. Finding a place in your still where it works can be difficult. If you add it to the column of the still, you want to make sure that you're not decreasing the flow, so you want to make sure that you are placing it so that you still have good flow and you're not creating a plug. If it goes into the boiling flask, you want to make sure that it's not going to cause scorching. If it sits on the bottom of the boiling flask, it can cause buildup and cause some scorching on the bottom of that flask. And then, placing it in a bulb is an option if you do have that. However, it can be difficult to get in and out of there, so something to think about. A digital scale is something that is super useful to have. I like to do all of my distillations by weight. We'll talk about that a little more later, why that is helpful. But the digital scale, ours can read in grams or pounds, which is nice. I typically like to keep it in metric units. One last component that is super useful to have would be bottles to receive spirits in, and then tape or some type of label that you can mark on. If you're doing a lot of different distillations, keeping track of everything is essential. So whatever system works for you, some way to track and label your distillates is going to be very helpful. Now we're going to prep our lab still and talk about how we set up for distillation. So to start, I'm going to take the boiling flask, put it on the scale, and tare the weight. So we're at 0 on the scale. Next, I've already weighed out 100 grams of botanicals. Today we're going to be doing a rosemary distillation. So I'm going to add that to the still. Again, this is where having that wide neck is really helpful. If you have a boiling flask with a narrower neck, it's going to be pretty difficult to get things in and out of the still. I like to use 100 grams of botanicals for most of my distillations. We'll talk about why we do that in a little bit. It is a good round number, and it makes doing some math easier later when you're going to blend. So now I have all my botanical in the boiling flask. I'm going to put it back on the scale. Again, I'm going to tare it, and I'm going to add water and neutral spirit to the boiling flask. I'm going to use 1,000 grams of each water and neutral spirit for this distillation. I like to be pretty close, but if I'm off by a little bit, it isn't the end of the world. Part of making things repeatable, though, is going to be doing the same thing every time. Now we're adding neutral spirit to the boiling flask. Again, we're going to add 1,000 grams of neutral spirit. I like to do 1,000 grams of water and 1,000 grams of neutral spirit, again for scaling, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but also because blended together it's going to give us an ABV about 53%, and that is a good starting point when you're building a recipe to start your distillations at. Different botanicals will have different extraction levels at different alcohols, so for some distillations you might find that 30% ABV is a better starting point for your lab still, and others you might find that 60% is better. That's definitely something you can play around with, but for a starting point for me, I always like to start at 1-to-1 by weight. So the last thing that's going to go into our boiling flask before we build our still is going to be a little bit of a silicone-based anti-foam. So this is Firm Cap. It's available at your brewing or distilling supply stores. It's just going to make sure that we don't get too much foaming in our distillation. I've got measured out 20 milliliters of that. I'm going to add that right to the boiling flask. Now that I have all the components in the boiling flask, I'm going to get that set up in the heating mantle. And then I'm going to start building my still. Again, we talked about using some silicone grease. I'm just going to put a little dab of silicone grease on all of the ground joints, and that's just going to produce a better seal than if I'm using without. These ground glass joints can also get stuck together, so that silicone grease is going to help to prevent that. So we've got the first part of our column on. I'm going to add a little to the line arm. I'm going to set our line arm up, and I'm going to attach it to the stand. Now, different heating mantles will be controlled differently. Some will have a dial right on the side. Ours is controlled by the controller, so I'm going to plug in the thermocouple into the controller. And I'm going to set up my receiving vessel. I always like to take a small heads cut on our distillations. The heads cut would be the first stuff that comes off the still. It's not always going to be necessary depending on what you're distilling, but if you had distilled something before your current botanical, there may be flavors residing in the line arm or throughout the still. So I always like to take a little heads cut when I do a distillation. I've got my receiving vessel set up on the stand here. I'm just going to crank that up so it's closer to the receiving line arm. And I'm going to adjust everything so that the receiver is right above our collection vessel. Now from here, important, you want to make sure that you always have cooling water to the still before you have heat. So I am going to turn on my cooling water, and that's going to fill the condenser. The cooling water will flow in counter direction of the spirit. So when we turn the still, the spirit's going to flow from the column down to the receiver. I want my cooling water then to flow from the receiver side to the spirit side. I'm going to adjust that flow a little bit to slow it down. There's a lot of volume of water in here, so we just really want to make sure that we have some flow and that our spirit is coming off cold. I don't have a temperature monitor on my cooling water, but that's something that you might want to think about as another form of control of the distillation. Now that we have the cooling water turned on, it's time to turn on our controller. Our controller is going to turn on, and that's going to cause the heating mantle to start to heat. Now, the boiling point of water is going to be around 212 degrees, where the boiling point of ethanol is going to be around 173 degrees Fahrenheit. That means that when I set my temperature on the still, I'm going to set it somewhere in between that boiling point of spirit and boiling point of water, and then I will adjust that as needed based on the flow coming off the still. The temperature is controlled off, again, the top of the still in this lab still. So it's going to be a little bit before we start to see temperature readings. Now we are just going to wait and watch the still as it heats up. This could take 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will start collecting. While the still's heating up, I wanted to take some time to talk with you guys about my personal philosophy for developing recipes for botanical spirits. Think gins, liqueurs, all those kind of fun things. I kind of have three principles to my philosophy on recipe development. One is layering flavors. Two is going to be distilling individual botanical fractions. Three is going to be distilling botanical concentrates. So increasing the amount of botanicals that you distill in one distillation that can then be blended out. I like to layer flavors because spirits with more than one flavor are going to be more interesting. You can think components that are flavor affinities. So today we're distilling a rosemary botanical fraction that will then go into our house amaretto. Almonds and rosemary have a really good flavor affinity together and work really well in a spirit. You can also do things that complement each other. If you are trying to make, say, a lime distillate or a lime liqueur, you may consider using both fresh limes and dried lime peels and playing with those botanicals to get a more round flavor. When I talk about layering flavors, that's what I'm talking about. Combining different flavors to get you a more interesting spirit. This is really where distilling becomes an art. It's up to the distiller to use his senses and his experiences to create an interesting new product. My second philosophy is to start with individual botanical fractions. What I mean by this is taking the different components that you want to play with and doing individual distillations with those botanicals. If you wanted to make a gin, say, with juniper, lime, and coriander, you could play around with the recipe and try those in different combinations in the distillation, or you could do individual distillates of each of those. I like to do the latter and do individual distillates. That way, after I've done 3 distillations, I've got the base components, and I combine those in an infinite amount of ways to come up with the exact flavor that I want. That really helps with recipe development, and then you can do it in a way that allows it to scale later on. The third component of my philosophy would be distilling in concentration. If you distill a botanical in a concentrated form, you can always thin it out with neutral spirit or water to stretch that botanical and give you the exact intensity that you want out of that flavor. Distilling it in concentration is going to save you time because you're going to do less distillations on it. And it's also going to save you space. When you scale it up, it's going to produce a smaller quantity of spirit that you have to store until you're ready to blend it. For different flavor concentrations, each botanical is unique. You can play around with different quantities, what goes into the still. I did here 100 grams of rosemary into 1,000 grams of water and 1,000 grams of neutral spirit. For different botanicals, that might be 50 grams or 60 grams. What I like to do is play around with that number, find what works, but make sure I'm taking notes and make sure I know what's going into the pot as a way to scale. That segues into talking about standardization and how we can standardize our recipes so that when we scale them up, they are readily able to do that. So when I talk about standardization, I want to talk about 3 things. I want to talk about standardizing what goes into the still. I want to standardize how I run the still, and I want to standardize what comes off the still. Going into the still, as we did before, I always like to start with that 10% botanical fraction, right? So 100 grams of botanicals, 1,000 grams of water, and 1,000 grams of neutral spirit. And why I like to do that is because it scales nicely. So I don't know the exact volume that we're going to get out of that recipe there. It's going to depend on the density of your botanicals and how it fits in the still. But I know that my still is 3 liters. As long as that fits, I can scale it based on that 3-liter factor. Our Christian Carl pot still in Denver has a working volume of around 600 liters. What that means is there's a factor of 200 between our lab still and our production still. So if I want to scale up, if I find a recipe that really works on the lab still, I just multiply everything by 200 to get it to size up to the production still. For example, if I wanted to scale this rosemary distillation up to the lab still, I'm going to multiply the 100 grams of rosemary by 200, and I'll get 20 kilograms of rosemary going into the still with 200 kilograms of water and 200 kilograms of neutral spirit. Standardizing what goes into the still here is really what allows you to scale it up to production just by multiplying by that factor. When I talk about standardizing how we run the still, I want to run the still the same way every time so that I have repeatable results. If I'm running the still at different temperatures, collecting different volumes, taking different hearts cuts, I'm always going to get a different result. Whereas if I standardize those different elements of running the still, I can always have repeatable results. So there are different ways to standardize what you're collecting off the still. What I like to do is when I'm initially starting a recipe, I like to taste and find out where that taste point is, where I like to make that heads cut and start collecting the hearts. When I find that cut point, what I want to do is I want to take a sample and I want to measure the ABV of where I'm taking that cut point, and I'll record any other data I can. Temperatures, volumes, all that stuff is useful for knowing that you're running the still the same way every time. For standardizing what comes off the still, what I'm interested in is taking the same amount of volume off the still every run, and then recording and collecting that and using that data going forward. So for this rosemary distillation, it's starting to heat up here. We are going to collect probably around 1.5 liters of distillate, and it'll be somewhere in the 70 ABV range. It won't exactly be 70 ABV, but it'll be 71, 72, 73. I know that from experience from doing this same setup time and time again. When I've collected that volume at that ABV, I like to standardize the proof down to a nice round number. So if I'm getting spirit off the still around 71%, I'm going to standardize that down to 70%. That way, for blending my recipes, I have nice round numbers to work with. If I'm coming off the still somewhere in the 68%, 67%, I'll standardize that down to 65%. Again, that means that when I build a recipe, I'm always starting with the same ABV. I don't have to adjust my recipe because the spirit I'm working with is a different proof. I'm going to standardize it down so that's always the same proof that I'm starting with. That covers my philosophy and how to standardize botanical fractions so that you can build recipes that scale. We'll talk about how we do that in the real world and go through some examples, but our lab still is about to boil off, so let's get back to that. As you can see, our lab still is starting to boil. That's going to be a sign that we're going to start distilling off soon. So we're boiling in the temperature here. You can see that we have vapor. We're starting to cool off and cloud in the bulb here. And now you can start to see we're dripping. So what we also start noticing is that our temperature is starting to climb. So our temperature has been reading ambient around 75 degrees. And over the next minute or so, that's really going to ramp up. You can watch your flows here. Again, we don't want anything boiling over. So if I look like I'm too foamy or this is getting too high, I can reduce the temperature to maintain that. And then you want to watch your flow. The temperature is now starting to climb, and I'm starting to see flow through the coil. Again, the spirit's running through the inside of the coil while the water is through the outside, and we're getting drip off from the still here. You can see that coming off the still here is pretty cloudy. That's likely from a previous distillation, leaving some residue in the condenser. Again, that's why we're going to take that heads cut. Not necessarily needed for flavor, but it will definitely improve through that first little section of distillation. My temperature is starting to climb. Again, I have it set for 195 degrees as the set point here. If that seems to be too fast or too slow flow coming off the still, I will adjust that. But right now that's looking like it's going to be pretty good. Now I've collected about 50 milliliters of heads, so I'm going to taste that and see if we are comfortable making a heads cut there. The smell on this is good. I'm happy with it. The taste is also right where I want it, so we're going to switch from collecting a heads fraction to collecting the hearts fraction. Now, again, I'm going to record the volume I've collected, and I will take an ABV reading of what I've collected and note that, so going forward I know that I can use that as a reference point for where I'm making my cut. I've got here a digital densitometer. It's handheld, it's a DMA. It's really good for taking fast readings during lab distillation or production. It's not accurate enough to take final proofs for bottling. But again, it's going to give us a quick reading on the line that will be useful for us for referencing going forward. So my cut point here was at 83.4% ABV, and I collected 50 milliliters of that. So I'm going to record 50 milliliters at 63.3 for my heads collection, and I will continue monitoring as we collect hearts from the still. While the lab's still running off, I wanted to give you an example of how we can blend components together to create those spirits or liqueurs. For this example, I've got fallen crabapple distillate, grapefruit distillate, and Christmas tree distillate. For the blend that I'm working on, I'm going to add 15 milliliters of the flowering crabapple distillate. I'm going to add 9 milliliters of the grapefruit distillate and 6 milliliters of the Christmas tree distillate. So my total distillate here is going to be 30%. I've standardized all these, so they're all at 70% alcohol. And I know my fraction of these in the final distillation. So I have 50% of the blend being the flowering crabapple, 30% being the grapefruit distillate, and 20% being the Christmas tree distillate. What that means is if I want to combine all of those together for a single distillation, I have all my recipes standardized, so what will go into the pot for a combined distillation, if we were doing a 100-gram batch, would be 50 grams of crabapple, 30 grams of grapefruit, and 20 grams of the Christmas tree. Again, we've done all of these botanicals in concentration, so what that means for my spirit or liqueur is that I can cut that with 30 milliliters of neutral spirit to double that volume. So because I've done everything in concentration, when I go to blend it, I can spread that out with neutral spirit, and it saves me the time, the work to create that much more spirit volume. And that's a lovely liqueur. Add sugar to it, proof it down with water, bottle it, ready to go. I've done it on the lab still. I really like it. Now I want to scale it up to production. If you know the amount that goes into the botanical mix, you can then scale it up. So if I want to eventually combine these in the still and distill them all together, I know what percent of each of these went into the still. So if I know that 50% is flowering crabapple, if I know that 30% is grapefruit and 20% is the Christmas tree, when I then go to scale it up, I can play around with adding those botanicals into the still in that combination of 50%, 30%, 20%, and see how that distillation goes. You may need to make some adjustments on that, but the idea is that you can work individually with the components, discover your blends, and then blend those botanicals into a final distillation that then scales up. We also know that when we distill these individually, they scale nicely to the production scale. So then when you combine them, they will also scale back up to that production size. Again, for us, it's a factor of 200, using 3 liters to 600 liters. For you, it's going to be different based on the size of your lab still and based on the size of your production still. When you scale to the production scale, you might find that combinations of different ingredients need to be adjusted for that production size. You're not going to get the exact same results off your lab still, but you can tweak those results based on how you're seeing the flavors. So some botanicals, the flavors will come off early in the still. So say juniper, you're going to get all those juniper notes nice and early in the distillation, and then they'll transition to some sweeter flavors, where then something like dill may be more present in the end of the run. So when you do a run of a combined batch of botanicals, you're going to get a spectrum. They're not all going to be in equal amounts throughout the entire distillation. It's going to go through waves. You're going to have your first botanical wave, your second botanical wave, your third botanical wave. It really comes down to that final tank, that blend in the tank, and does that whole picture match what you came up with on the lab still? If it does, great, you're there. If it doesn't, you could easily do some concentrated fractions on your lab still and then add those back to the production still. So say you did this combination on the production still and the Christmas tree didn't come through as much as you want. Okay, so you can do a small batch on your lab still of just the Christmas tree and blend that back in to where you're happy with it, and then keep that in mind, and when you go to redo it the next time, factor that in and maybe increase the amount of Christmas tree that goes into it to begin with. It's definitely a learning curve, definitely something that you have to fit into your own production. You may find that it is easier for you and it works better for you to scale up and do only the individual fractions on your large production still. that's completely fine. If you do 3 batches on your production still of 3 individual botanicals, then you've created 3 batches worth of product. It means you have to store that and you have to think about that when you're doing it, but you certainly can do that, and there are distillers who have had great success individually distilling botanicals and combining them on a production scale. You may find that it works for you to try to combine them and do 1 batch of the botanicals altogether. We talked before that you can play around with different extraction points for the botanicals, different proofs which you go into the still to distill them at. So starting at 30%, going up to 60%, that's the range that I really find works well. You may find that you have a botanical that works really well at 30%, but it doesn't work with other botanicals at 60%. So you may have to do different distillations at different proofs with botanicals that group together. That's also something you can think about, is if you're having a hard time combining all the botanicals you need in the production run, you can think about splitting them into botanicals that have flavor affinities and distill well together. So that might be all your citrus elements can distill together, whereas some of your more herbal or your floral or your piney, junipery, those notes may need to be distilled separately. But again, you could group those together and do a couple different fractions to get the flavor that you want. When you reach the end of distillation, it's time to turn off the still and clean up. You'll know you'll reach the end of the distillation based on your individual process. For us, we know the volume we collect, and we'll also know the taste and the proof. I'm going to taste the spirit. Yep, that feels like the end of the collection for me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off our heating mantle, but I'll let the water run for a couple more minutes as the still cools down and vapor continues to condense. I'll take a note of how much volume I've collected, and I'll take an ABV reading of what I've collected and note that so I can continue to keep track of my standardization moving forward. We don't collect a tails cut when we do botanical fractions, as we don't have anything to do with them. We can't recycle them. Once we are happy with the heart fraction that we've collected, it's time to turn off the still and clean up. As the still cools down, I wanted to introduce you to how you can use a lab still to test the ABV of liqueurs. Anything with sugar in it is not going to read accurately on a densitometer or a hydrometer. However, you can do a distillation of that liqueur so that you can test with a hydrometer or densitometer. For us, we have a line of ready-to-drink cocktails, our automatic line, where we take spirit, add sugars and botanicals to create bottled cocktails. With the sugar added, we can't use the hydrometer or the densitometer to read this, so we'll set up for a distillation for that. Now, if you have a densitometer that is TTB rated, you only need to do a small amount of distillate, say 100 milliliters for your benchtop distillation. However, if you are relying on hydrometers that are TTB approved, you may need a larger volume. The hydrometers we have fit into 500 milliliter graduated cylinders. So for us to be able to take a reading with one of our TTB rated hydrometers, we would have to do a larger volume of distillation. Whenever it comes to proofing, checking, or gauging spirits for TTB for tax purposes, you should always reference back to the TTB manual to make sure you're doing everything correctly. The TTB also offers videos online that will go more in depth into how they want you to do the lab distillations. I wanted to really introduce you to the basic principles and show you how you could start to set up a lab distillation. For the lab distillation, because it's a scientific procedure here, it can be more labor intensive. Take your time and make sure everything is done exactly correctly. It may be worth it for you to outsource this to a lab who specializes in these procedures, as it's going to save you time that you would spend doing the distillations yourself. When first starting out using your lab still for distillation to measure proof, it's always good to validate your work. What that would mean would be starting with a spirit that you know the proof of going into it, so something that you can measure with your hydrometer or densitometer, say vodka, and know that your starting proof is 40, do your lab distillation and check that you are getting that result. If you can hit that repeatably several times, then you can probably do the process of the lab distillation yourself. If you find that you can't hit that number, then it's best to have someone else do it. My lab still has now cooled down a little bit, so it's time to break down the lab still and clean up. I'm going to start by turning off the water. And then I am going to collect my spirit into a bottle. Again, we talked about it being important to label your work and keep track of what you've done. I am going to label my rosemary distillate and set that aside. Later I'll go back and check the proof, record it, and then standardize it down to my proof that I want to work with for my spirits. Label this as rosemary distillate and set it aside. Can also be helpful to date your work so that if you have any questions about it later, you can go reference your notes and see which batch it was. To break down my still, I'm going to put on my heat-proof rubber gloves, and I'm going to take apart the still opposite of the way I set it up. I'm going to unplug from the control panel. I'm going to undo the stand. I'm going to pull off the line arm and condenser, set that down. Lab glass can be expensive, so you always want to use caution and care when dealing with it. I'm going to take off my column and bulb. Again, set that down. And I'm going to proceed to clean out my boiling flask. I like to dump it through a strainer into the sink just to clean out everything that we have in there. Setting up for a lab distillation for proof is going to be very similar to setting up for a regular lab distillation. The difference is going to be you want to take extra care to make sure all your volumes are correct. For a TTB proofing distillation, we're going to need our spirit that we're starting with to be right at 20 degrees Celsius. You can do that using a water bath, or if your ambient temperature is right around 70 degrees, you should be good there. What we're going to do is we're going to measure out exactly 100 milliliters of our spirit. And again, this is where you want to be very accurate. You're reading from the bottom of the meniscus on your level here. And the idea is that 100 milliliters at 40% alcohol has 40% alcohol by volume in there, and it doesn't really matter how much other stuff is in there, how much sugar, how many other spices, anything else in there. We're going to add our 100 milliliters to the still. And then we're going to rinse our graduated cylinder 3 times with 50 milliliters of water. And that water will also go into the still. This is to get all of the alcohol, any residual, into the still so that your reading is accurate. So that's 3 rinses. We'll get that into the still, and then we'll close up our still, same way we did previously, to set up for the distillation. We've got our column that goes into the bulb, and then our line arm that goes on top of the column. I just used this still earlier, so there's still enough of the silicone grease on the joints that they're still making a good seal. I'm going to plug in my temperature control. I'm going to turn on my water, and then I'm going to start the distillation by turning on the control system. For collection, we're going to collect back into a 100 milliliter vessel. And our goal is to collect just below 100 milliliters. So we started with 100 milliliters. We're expecting to leave some volume behind in the pot still, but what we're expecting to leave behind in the still is going to be our sugar and our water. We're going to collect this distillation until we get to just below 100 milliliters, and then we'll add a little bit of water to make up to that 100 milliliters, and then we'll take an ABV reading of that to check our final proof. Again, this is something that I recommend testing out with a vodka or a gin, something where you know the ABV going into the pot. So if I buy a vodka off the shelf in a liquor store and I know that it's been tested and it's at 40% ABV, I can take a reading on that with my densitometer, verify that it's 40%, run the distillation, add my makeup water back in, and I should take another reading that is, again, reading 40% ABV. The TTV lets you have some flexibility in what your readings must be. You have 0.3% on either side of your target. So if you're bottling a vodka at 40%, you can bottle it at 40.3% or 39.7% ABV and be within spec for the TTB. It's always good to target right at 40% if that's what your spec is for. That way you have the most room of flexibility if anything goes wrong. This is a smaller distillation run. It should take 20 or 30 minutes to do this small volume in our still. You may find that smaller volumes are harder to run if your still is large. So you may want to consider buying the right piece of equipment if what you really plan to do is a lot of benchtop lab distillations for proofing. The idea on the proofing distillation is that we know the volume that went in at the beginning, and we should know the ABV pretty close. And at the end, we're distilling over, and we're going to distill all the alcohol over, but not necessarily all the water, right? So water is going to remain behind in the pot. So if we started with 100 milliliters, we need to end with 100 milliliters. That way we're comparing apples to apples and our proof is the same. The reading is alcohol by volume. So if you're not proofing it to 100 milliliters exactly, then the volume is wrong. So your ABV is going to not accurately reflect what was in your starting amount. These runs can go quicker because the volume is less. Again, if you need to take a reading with a hydrometer for your final proof, then you may need to upsize your batch to collect a volume that you can successfully read with a hydrometer. Something to consider if you are doing these test distillations with liqueurs is that depending on how much sugar is in your mixture and how much residual water you have in the boiling pot, you can get some scorching on the bottom of the boiling flask. So you really want to match your size of your still to your sample size. The 100 milliliter sample run on this still is pretty small for it. I wouldn't go much smaller than that. I've done some successfully, but it would be easy enough to scale it up to 500 milliliters for a run to fit this scale size. You should also always do your tests in duplicate or triplicate. So just because you get one result that matches doesn't necessarily mean that it is accurate. It's always good after you validated your still to run a sample twice at least to make sure your numbers are corroborating each other. We've now collected around 98 milliliters of volume. So we're going to turn off the still and complete that distillation. I'm going to change out my flasks. If we have any drips, we'll just go into a residual collection container. And I'm going to take my graduated cylinder, which we've collected into. It's at just around 98 milliliters, so I'm going to add some water just until we hit that 100 milliliter line. Again, we're going to read from the bottom of the meniscus so that we have the accurate volume. We're going to leave residual sugars and water in the still, and all the alcohol that was initially in that 100 milliliters should now be in this 100 milliliters that we've collected. I've added my water to get it to the same starting volume, and I'll swirl it around to get everything to mix in together. Again, for this to be accurate and measured correctly, everything should be done at room temperature. So you should check that your collection here is right around 20 degrees Celsius. From here, I'll take a measurement and check that things are reading correctly. Again, our DMA is not TTB certified. Using this DMA, I can't have a result that the TTB will approve for labeling. So for us, we would have to use hydrometers and we would have to distill a better sample. This is always a good check in your process, in your line, to make sure your systems are in place. And then if you can do this accurately, you can do it correctly, it's still good to have an outside lab verify it. Our starting ABV was right at 40% in the bottle, but with sugar, so we couldn't read it correctly. Our sample here is now reading 40%. So that shows us that we did the distillation correctly, we got the measurement accurate to how we want it, and it shows you how to do the distillation. In today's class, we've covered the components of a lab still and what you need in a lab to run the lab still. We've talked about how to set up and run your lab still. We've talked about my system of formulating recipes, the philosophy that I have that includes concentrated fractions, layering flavors, and distilling individual botanicals. We talked about all the ways that you can standardize through the distillation process. And we talked about how to then do a test distillation of a liqueur using your lab still. Thanks for joining today's class. I hope that you've learned something today that you can incorporate into your process, that it's something that you are able to play around with and make your own, and that it's able to make you a more technical distiller. We'd love to host you at the Family Jones, our spirit house here in Denver, so that you can try some of the products that we've talked about making today. You can also find our spirits throughout Colorado, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. Thanks again. I hope you enjoyed the class.